he had said, "Let them kill us all," after a reporter covering Mexico's drug war was murdered earlier this year. And now award-winning journalist Javier Valdez is also dead, gunned down on the street. He's the latest casualty in what the International Institute for Strategic Studies says is the second deadliest conflict in the world. The International Institute for Strategic Studies research report says 23,000 people were killed in Mexico in 2016. That's a 72% increase from 2015, when 16,700 were killed. Out of every 10 homicides there, 7 are carried out by drug cartels. The cartels are financed by drug sales to the US, estimated to average $24 billion annually. The largest and deadliest is the Sinaloa cartel, named after the Mexican state where it's based. That's also the state with the highest murder rate. Critics accuse Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto of failing to strengthen security there and across the country. That may be due to endemic corruption and fear of retaliation by the cartels. And recent moves by the newly elected US leadership may prove detrimental in the long fight against drugs.
Going forward, I have empowered our prosecutors to charge and pursue the most serious offense, as I believe the law requires, most serious, readily provable offense.
Experts say the US Attorney General's decision means first-time drug offenders arrested for non-violent crimes will face the same sentence as hardcore drug cartel members. They point to research that such laws push first-time offenders towards a life of criminality and will fuel the violence, such as the recent spike in drug cartel-related killings. And more money means greater power for the cartels in Mexico as they butcher their way to more control. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to further discuss the war on drugs, I'm joined now by David Shirk. He is the Director of Justice in Mexico and an Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of San Diego. From Oaxaca, Mexico, Laura Carlson. She is the Director of the Americas Program at the Center for International Policy. And in London, Mike Trace. He has decades of experience in drug policy with various international agencies, including the United Nations, the EU, and he was formerly the chair of the International Drug Policy Consortium. Thanks all so much for joining us. Let's begin then with a look at this report from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, as there seems to be some disagreement on its veracity. Laura Carlson, you believe the reality is as bad as this report says, correct?
Absolutely, we see this from here in Mexico. The report calls Mexico an armed conflict, and that's the major point that the Mexican government has contended. But the criteria of territorial control by armed groups, a threat to the state that's sustained, and the deployment of armed forces are clearly complied with in the case of Mexico. Moreover, the number of deaths, even though the Mexican government contests that this is the total number of homicides and not just related to the drug war itself, even if you took out a base level of homicides for other reasons, and of course the report, what they say is, we know that, but the Mexican government isn't giving out statistics for just drug war-related homicides, so we're forced to use this number. But even if you calculated a baseline, you still have this huge number that's fairly clearly attributed to the drug war. And we know this because, as it mentions, in a non-conventional warfare, this is not indiscriminate killings by bombings of civilians, but the majority of these killings are selective, and they're actually execution-style murders.
Okay, David Shirk, you feel those numbers are exaggerated, actually. Go ahead.
I think Laura's incorrect in stating that the majority of the 23,000 homicides last year were execution-style committed by multiple groups. There are actually some really good estimates that come out of various sources, non-governmental sources, which indicate the proportion of organized crime style killings that we see in Mexico. And the best estimates that we see top that number out at about 10 or 12,000 last year. So perhaps at most half of the homicides that we saw last year in Mexico were organized crime style. But a larger point here is that even if you took all 23,000 homicides in Mexico and said that they were caused by organized crime, that's half the number of homicides we saw in Brazil last year, where many of the same conditions exist. And so if you were looking for the greatest conflict, certainly in the Americas, you would point to Brazil. So this report singles out Mexico, perhaps for very good reasons. Certainly we've seen a militarization of the conflict. Certainly the Mexican government has not done a very good job in dealing with drug trafficking organizations. But the base facts that are used in this report are not facts.
Laura, I'll let you respond.
Well, they certainly are facts. I mean, the number of homicides comes directly from the government figures. As everyone has admitted, being able to separate those from regular homicides is very difficult. But if you look at the graph of how homicides have increased as a result of this drug war model, it's very clear the effect of the drug war in this huge number of homicides. And if you look like baseline numbers of homicides, for example, around the 8,000 mark before the drug war began, then it's clear that this is related. There's also a blurry line between what is a drug war related homicide and not. First of all, there are no investigations. Very seldom are there investigations. It's a nation that's known for its impunity and for a dysfunctional justice system, so we can't know that. And secondly, there are a number of homicides that are related to the spread of arms that have happened within the context of the drug war. Why is this important to try to get these numbers together and define Mexico as an armed conflict? It's important because much of this armed conflict in Mexico is a direct result of state policy. And that is at the end of 2006 when the drug war is imposed and there's this decision to fight drug cartels in a military manner is when we see this explosion of violence. And until we recognize this, and until the international community recognizes that state policies are involved in the violence here, we will not be able to communicate the gravity of the situation and begin to look for other solutions that can lead us toward peace instead of this spiraling violence.
Okay, Mike Trace, I'm going to let you jump in there because you also seem to think the war on drugs is being fought from the wrong angle.
And I think the exchange you just heard shows how hard it is to interpret what's actually happening on the ground. But I think we can all agree that these figures and this trend is very disappointing for the Peña Nieto government, which has given some good policy leadership when they came into power, certainly some leadership at the United Nations to say that the level of violence in Mexico and many other countries related to drug markets was unacceptable, and we had to try significantly different strategies to bring that violence down. As I say, President Peña Nieto has given some good international leadership on that issue, but these figures show that on the ground, the policies are not being implemented and the improvements are not being seen within Mexico. So a real dilemma here.
But what about, I mean, what Laura was saying about how this so-called war on drugs is actually being fought? David Shirk, I'll let you comment on this. Is this somewhat military approach to fighting cartels the best strategy out there?
Everyone, I think, in this conversation agrees that it is not the best strategy. But distorting the facts and trying to characterize all homicides in Mexico, or the vast majority of homicides in Mexico, as drug-related is a flawed strategy in itself. Laura completely ignored my point about Brazil, which again has twice as many homicides, many of the same conditions. Why aren't we pointing the finger at Brazil? Our organization, Justice in Mexico, has spent the last decade tracking these homicides and trying to call attention to drug-related homicides for exactly the same reason that Laura has. But I think this report uses a very sensationalistic strategy, one that is loose at best with the facts, and it does so simply to gain attention. And I think that's unfortunate because, number one, the conditions are bad enough in Mexico and they speak for themselves, so we don't need to distort them. And number two, distorting those facts, I think, does a disservice to the many other conflicts around the world, armed conflicts, where citizens are fighting against their government for political reasons. I think it does a disservice to the many other people who are dying around the world in the name of freedom.
Okay, Mike, let me ask you, because there is a point, a very important point here that this report doesn't highlight quite as strongly, and that is that without consumers, without customers, there is no market, period. So in large part, it is wealthy U.S. citizens and European consumers that are actually empowering these drug cartels, particularly in the cocaine trade. So let me ask you why you think more effort isn't being made to expose and penalize those privileged customers who use cocaine recreationally and continue to drive this trade and its lucrative ends?
Well, there's no doubt that demand drives the profits that the cartels are fighting over, and the biggest demand, the biggest profits are to be made in the lucrative Western markets. That global balance is changing somewhat in recent years, but it's still the case that for Mexican traffickers, U.S. demand is their biggest market. Of course, a lot has been tried by the U.S. government and local authorities, and same across the world, to reduce demand and to create the conditions where the market is stifled. These strategies have not managed to reduce demand massively. There are upticks and downticks, but basically in an illegal market that's not regulated, then there is always going to be a large amount of profit to be made by the most violent and the most ruthless. And that's the set of conditions we have in Mexico and across Latin America at the moment. As I've said, there's some good policy initiatives in Mexico and elsewhere to try and change these realities, but we're seeing that the results in Mexico at the moment are yet to bear fruit. And on the point of a war on drugs, or what might be called a war on drugs, or escalating state conflict, we do now have pretty good evidence over decades now that any time that a military approach is taken to take on the cartels, the violence upticks. And Mexico experienced that through the last 10 years, and we've seen that in other countries as well. So there is a real dilemma here. I don't think you can easily stifle the market, the demand for the market. US authorities are trying to do that. And you can't easily defeat the cartels. That sends that's a very nice political soundbite, but you can't create the situation where the profit isn't there and the power of organized crime isn't there. So we do have to find new ways of responding to this problem, because Mexico, like many countries, is finding that the nature and the cycle of violence continues whether you crack down or whether you tolerate.
Laura, I'll let you jump in there. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I wanted to respond to the point about Brazil. I wrote the International Institute for Strategic Studies, sent them the response of the Mexican government, and they came back and they said Brazil and Venezuela, countries that do have higher homicide rates, are not included in this study for the reasons that we do not consider them armed conflicts because of the criteria I mentioned before. That's why Mexico is there and other countries are not. This is a very important distinction and one of the contributions of this study. By seeing Mexico as not just dispersed criminality, but as an armed conflict, we have to go to the roots of what's going on here. And that's why continuing to do the same thing and go up against different cartels in the various places where violence explodes is going to create more violence, as we've seen, despite a slight tendency downward. Now we've got a peak upward, which goes to show that there's been no structural improvement in fighting this so-called war on drugs, and brings us back to the point that the strategy is causing the violence. And that's why I think it's a positive thing to call attention to this violence. As someone who lives here, as a human rights defender and a journalist, two categories that have been particularly targeted in this violence, you know, there's a desperation for the international community to respond to what's going on and to convince both the Mexican and the US governments that there's urgent need to change strategies and demilitarize this conflict immediately.
Okay. David, let me ask you on strategy, when these harsher penalties are introduced for drug crimes, as we've just seen Attorney General Jeff Sessions do in the United States, the people most likely to end up in jail are often the poorest users, and they end up kind of further burdening a system that's already completely overwhelmed. It didn't seem to work under Reagan, yet we're seeing it repeated now under Sessions. Do you think it will be any different this time?
No, I think that what we will see as a result of harsher penalties for drug offenses is more people needlessly going to jail for what is effectively a public health problem. As Michael pointed out in his comments, there are much better ways to tackle the problem of drug use in our societies, and I think all three of us probably agree on that idea. The challenge is that throughout the United States and throughout this hemisphere, unfortunately, the costs of our policies are being borne by many of the people at the bottom rungs of society. And whether we're talking about Mexico or Brazil, where the drug war is very actively being fought, including tanks and including major organized crime groups like we see in Mexico, you're seeing the poorest of the poor being dragged into this. And basically because in many cases they have no other options. They don't have educational opportunities and they don't have job opportunities. And so their best opportunity is found in the black market. Unfortunately, if we try to lock people up as the solution to this, there will always be another person to take their place who is in need of educational or employment opportunities.
Okay.
And so I think we all agree on that.
Mike, let me wrap up with you then. What are these better ways? What are the strategies that are being missed here to fight and potentially even win the war on drugs?
One on demand reduction, one on supply reduction. First of all, agree with David entirely. What Jeff Sessions is playing with in the US, which is increasing penalties again, has been tried many times by the US and others. Whatever you think about the harshness or otherwise of those policies, they don't work. They don't reduce demand. So the objective will not be met and a lot of people will be harmed along the way. On supply side, the objective has to be very focused on what does it take to undermine the power of the organized crime cartels that are profiting from this illegal trade. Some posit that you can do that by creating a regulated market, which is happening with cannabis now. Some posit you can do that by creating your law enforcement strategies that tolerate some sorts of distribution of illegal drugs and clamp down on others. It's called smart enforcement. So smart enforcement strategies on the supply side and more tolerant strategies on the demand side, and we'll start getting to grips with this policy in a way that creates much less violence.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us. Laura Carlson there from Oaxaca, Mexico, David Shirk in San Diego, and Mike Trace in London. Thanks for being on the Newsmakers.